In the autumn of 1901, while newspaper headlines screamed about railroad wars and financial panics, the most powerful trader on Wall Street walked through the financial district unrecognized. James R. Keene had arrived in New York with California dust still on his boots and a reputation forged in the volatile mining exchanges of the 1,870 where he learned the fundamental truth that would define his career. Information travels faster than capital, and visibility costs money in worse prices. By 1901, Keene controlled an estimated $50 million, equivalent to over $1.5 billion in today's currency, yet operated with such deliberate invisibility that seasoned market veterans called him a rumor in a frock coat. This wasn't accidental anonymity, but engineered stealth based on mathematical precision and psychological insight. He had discovered the central paradox of institutional trading. Large capital naturally moves markets against itself through simple supply and demand mechanics, yet he consistently accumulated enormous positions at prices that should have been theoretically unavailable once his buying pressure entered the equation. Keene understood that liquidity was not merely a pile of shares waiting for him, but a living system of depth, timing, and psychology. He gauged how much a market could absorb at different hours, whether sellers were urgent or casual, whether a downtick revealed genuine weakness or simply shook loose the impatient. There was no modern language for market microstructure, yet he acted as if the blueprint were etched in his mind, reading the tape like the margins of a ledger, and measuring not only what traded, but what refused to trade. While his contemporaries announced their intentions through aggressive buying that telegraphed their moves to competitors, Keene had mastered the delicate art of moving massive positions without creating telltale market disturbances. He preferred to let the market come to him, placing orders where natural flow would deliver stock without protest. When he did act, it was in fragments that felt like weather rather than will, scattering his presence across brokers, across hours, across venues, so that no single observer could connect the dots. The public thought force moved prices, but Keene prized invisibility above all else. He had transformed market structure itself into a competitive advantage, understanding that seen power invited opposition, while unseen power invited liquidity, and that distinction would shape everything that followed in his legendary career. While his contemporaries chased whispered tips in hotel lobbies and traded on hunches born from yesterday's newspapers, James Keene approached the chaotic symphony of Wall Street with the precision of a conductor reading sheet music. He treated each trading session not as a gamble but as a mathematical equation with measurable variables and predictable solutions. At the heart of his revolutionary method lay what he privately termed his absorption theory, a sophisticated framework for calculating exactly how much volume a market could digest at different price levels without the slightest adverse movement. Keene's equation operated across three critical dimensions that most operators never recognized. Timing governed when markets were most receptive to large orders, and he discovered through meticulous observation that certain hours offered natural camouflage, while others amplified every transaction into unwanted attention. He arrived early each morning not to trade, but to listen, keeping detailed notebooks of market rhythms, how many shares turned over in the first half hour, how volume decayed into the lunch lull, how late afternoon revived with money releasing from banks. Distribution allowed him to fragment massive positions across multiple brokers and timeframes, ensuring no single channel carried enough current to reveal his true intentions. Camouflage transformed his institutional operations into what appeared to be ordinary market activity, making carefully orchestrated accumulation indistinguishable from natural trading flow. His mathematical approach extended to surgical precision in execution. When targeting a 100,000 share position, a colossal sum for his era, Keene would never assault the market with brute force. Instead, he calculated that he could absorb roughly 1/10 of average daily volume without leaving fingerprints, perhaps 1/5 when news or rebalancing provided cover. He read market depth far beyond visible bids and offers, discerning hidden supply and demand lurking beneath the surface, identifying accumulation zones where patient capital could build positions and distribution phases where smart money quietly unloaded inventory. This systematic transformation of market structure into readable patterns allowed him to consistently acquire stock at prices that conventional theory suggested should have been unattainable once his buying pressure entered the equation. Keene's genius lay in transforming accumulation from a crude exercise in buying stock into an art form that anticipated what would later be codified as the principle of cause and effect, the patient building of positions that eventually justified significant price movements without revealing their architectural foundation. He selected securities the way a surveyor chose ground, studying the topography of volume and volatility until he could see precisely where pressure would pool and where it would naturally escape. His method unfolded across three distinct phases, each designed to make institutional activity indistinguishable from the market's own breathing. Disguise came first and demanded absolute precision. Keene scattered his intentions across multiple brokers like seeds planted in different fields, ensuring no single intermediary could glimpse the full scope of his operations. His network extended from New York to Boston to Philadelphia, with each agent believing they were handling routine business rather than fragments of a massive, coordinated campaign. Orders arrived at different houses throughout the day, varying deliberately in size and timing to prevent the pattern recognition that would alert competing professionals to institutional sponsorship. He never allowed his presence to accumulate in any single channel where observant tape readers might detect the signature of organized buying. The absorption phase required even greater discipline, as Keene bought only what the market naturally offered without forcing transactions that would telegraph his urgency to the entire trading community. His bids sat just beneath the noise, replenished rather than raised, welcoming stock that drifted down on boredom rather than fear. He positioned patient limit orders where sellers would find him rather than chasing offers that announced his intentions. When offers thinned and prices ticked higher, he resisted the amateur impulse to pursue. Instead, he tested market responsiveness with surgical precision. During the reorganization fever of 1899, as American steel and wire changed hands amid newspaper headlines, Keene demonstrated these principles on an institutional scale. He spread quiet buying across lunch hours when clerks abandoned their posts and the tape slowed to a whisper, exploiting natural lulls when market depth thinned and fewer eyes monitored transactions. His order sizes varied by deliberate design, sometimes a handful of shares, sometimes a larger block, always changing cadence to prevent any predictable signature that competing professionals might recognize and exploit. The testing phase revealed Keene's most sophisticated insight into market psychology. Small selling orders disclosed how quickly bids reappeared after minor pressure, while carefully placed buying interest measured whether offers multiplied or dried up under gentle demand. A few shares, sold into a rising market, told him whether demand was genuine or merely a temporary vacuum. He measured how the market healed from these deliberate scratches, watching for the speed and character of recovery that would indicate whether floating supply was truly shrinking or simply hiding. On the tape, the signatures of professional accumulation became unmistakable to those who understood the language. Volatility declined subtly as nervous holders departed. Volume dried up on minor pullbacks indicating selling exhaustion, and lows gradually refused to undercut previous levels in the almost imperceptible shift toward higher bottoms that signaled institutional sponsorship without announcing it. Days of dull drift pleased Keene more than bursts of excitement, because dullness meant absorption, and absorption meant ownership transferring without protest or competition. While amateurs grew impatient with this measured pace and chased the first breakouts they could identify, they were promptly met by Keene's waiting offers, unknowingly donating liquidity to positions he had built methodically when the street was asleep. Their impulsive behavior revealed intentions that professionals like Keene had learned to camouflage completely, transforming patient capital deployment into systematic competitive advantage that operated beyond the reach of conventional market observation. The morning of the 6th of May, 1901, began with deceptive tranquility as James Keene arrived at his downtown office, unaware that his most sophisticated accumulation campaign was about to collide with an equally secretive operation conducted by Edward Harriman across town. For months, both men had been quietly cornering Northern Pacific Railroad, using identical methods of patient absorption and strategic invisibility, neither realizing they were hunting the same limited prey until the mathematics turned hostile and the float vanished beneath their competing bids. What had begun as routine, accumulation transformed into financial warfare as Northern Pacific rocketed from $110 per share toward levels that defied all reasonable valuation. Keene watched his carefully engineered invisibility evaporate as the stock climbed past $300, then $500, then $700, each tick announcing to the entire street that institutional forces had broken the market's natural breathing rhythm. His absorption theory, designed for markets that could replenish supply as prices rose, suddenly confronted the reality of finite inventory pursued by infinite determination. By May 9th, Northern Pacific briefly touched $1,000 per share as both syndicates realized they were trapped in a corner of their own making. The tape told the story in staccato bursts while brokers clawed for shares that no longer existed. Call money screamed to confiscatory rates, and operators who had never touched the railroad were forced to liquidate everything else to survive the cascade of margin calls and failed positions. Keene recognized that the problem was no longer price but solvency, no longer tactics but system stability. He shifted from accumulation to crisis management, working behind the scenes to engineer the diplomatic resolution that would allow orderly settlement while preserving market integrity. The episode that had begun with his whisper-quiet methods ended with his negotiating skills, proving that understanding market structure included knowing when mathematical precision must yield to systemic preservation. His carefully constructed invisibility had become dramatically visible under extreme pressure, validating his liquidity theories while revealing the inherent risks when competing giants hunted identical territory. The shock of Northern Pacific did not harden Keene into rigidity but refined him into something more sophisticated, an operator who thought in layers rather than lines, building exposure like a master mason setting stone, course upon course, each supporting the next, without bearing the full weight alone. He emerged from the railroad corner with a revolutionary insight. Market structure itself was evolving, demanding methods that could adapt to increased scrutiny and more complex competitive dynamics through strategic distribution rather than concentrated force. His solution was layered positioning, a technique that distributed massive market exposure across multiple intermediaries operating on different time frames and price levels to minimize detection while maximizing strategic flexibility. Instead of concentrating orders through single channels that had nearly destroyed him during the Railroad War, Keene arranged a constellation of brokers, each entrusted with fragments of the larger plan, each working to different rhythms that disguised institutional coordination as natural market activity. When J.P. Morgan selected him to manage distribution of the newly formed United States Steel Corporation, the largest stock offering in financial history at over $1 billion, Keene's evolved methods faced their ultimate test. He stabilized the massive float by distributing shares as if pouring from multiple small spouts rather than a single heavy ladle, matching supply to the market's natural thirst without overwhelming its capacity for absorption. His advanced innovations included phantom orders that tested market depth without committing capital, allowing him to map liquidity pools before deploying actual positions. Options became tools for controlling vast positions with minimal capital commitment, providing leverage without announcing intentions. He coordinated across exchanges and across the Atlantic, using London's appetite during overlapping hours to ease New York's burden, creating global liquidity networks decades before such concepts had names. The fundamental ethic remained unchanged. Read, supply, and demand as they naturally existed. Never attempt to manufacture artificial pictures that would invite competition or regulatory scrutiny. When James R. Keene died in January 1913, the financial press struggled to measure the magnitude of his influence because his greatest achievements had been deliberately invisible, woven into the fabric of market structure so seamlessly that they appeared to be natural law rather than human innovation. Yet across the decades that followed, his mathematical approach to liquidity and systematic invisibility would echo through every generation of institutional money management, from the birth of mutual funds through the rise of hedge funds, to the algorithmic systems that now execute billions of shares in electronic silence. On a modern execution desk, the glow of multiple monitors illuminates a scene Keene would recognize instantly, even if the music now plays in code. A parent order appears on screen. Accumulate 800,000 shares over 3 sessions without disturbing the price. The instruction routes to an algorithm that breathes like a patient animal, waking at the opening bell with modest appetite, fading through the lunch lull, reviving when closing auctions swell with natural volume. The system never consumes more than a sliver 10 to 20% of average daily volume on any single venue because beyond that threshold, the market feels the pressure and reprices the privilege of entry. Orders fragment into irregular children that randomize cadence and size. resting at the bid, flashing briefly at midpoints in dark pools, sweeping the visible book only when spreads compress and depth thickens naturally. His notebooks have become mathematical models, what he sensed through tape reading, absorption capacity, seller urgency. The telltale refusal of lows to surrender now lives in impact curves and participation schedules calibrated to volatility and liquidity patterns, where he stationed clerks across multiple cities to disguise institutional coordination. Smart routers now triangulate dozens of venues in microseconds, measuring effort against result, rewarding patience when supply drifts in organically, accelerating only when natural flow provides adequate cover. The three-dimensional framework he developed for reading, market depth, timing, distribution, and camouflage remains as relevant in electronic markets as it was during the era of handwritten tickets and floor-based execution. The patience Keene demonstrated in building positions through natural market rhythms became the foundation for volume-weighted average price strategies that fragment large orders across optimal execution windows. His understanding that visibility costs money and worse prices evolved into the dark pool networks where institutional trades now occur away from public scrutiny. His systematic approach to position sizing based on average daily volume anticipated by decades the sophisticated models that modern institutions use to minimize market impact when deploying significant capital. The discipline he brought to working with natural supply and demand flows rather than against them continues to separate successful institutional investors from those who donate liquidity to more sophisticated operators. Yet beyond the mechanical evolution of his techniques lies a philosophical framework that transcends any particular era of market regulation or technological advancement. Keene taught that market structure is readable rather than random, systematic rather than chaotic, and that true competitive advantage comes from understanding these patterns deeply enough to work within them rather than against them. His recognition that patience multiplies purchasing power while urgency diminishes, it remains a cornerstone principle for anyone seeking to deploy capital with precision rather than hope. The psychological constants he identified, the interplay of fear and greed, the delicate balance of supply and demand, the strategic value of being underestimated persist unchanged beneath the surface of electronic transformation. Modern portfolio managers still face his central challenge: how to move significant capital efficiently without telegraphing intentions to competing professionals who would exploit any revealed information for their own advantage. His solution, strategic invisibility achieved through mathematical precision and psychological insight, continues to define institutional best practices. Risk management protocols, now standard across sophisticated trading desks, echo his adaptations to different market regimes, while compliance frameworks ensure that reading market structure never crosses into attempts at artificial manipulation. The ghost of Wall Street had transformed speculation from gambling into engineering, proving that the most effective way to move mountains of capital was not with dramatic announcements, but with disciplined whispers that respected the market's inherent logic. In the end, James R. Keene's greatest legacy was not any single technique, but the demonstration that strategic invisibility, when combined with systematic understanding and patient execution, remains the most potent form of market power. A lesson that continues to echo through the electronic canyons of modern finance, as relevant today as it was when he first walked the cobblestones of Lower Manhattan over a century ago.